Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Dr. Yvonne Cason, the president, actually group leader of Toronto Awakening Sharing Group. I'm also the president of Spiritual Awakenings International, but today's event is a Toronto Awakening Sharing Group event. And Toronto Awakening Sharing Group is a safe place for people to share their stories of their spiritually transformative experiences and to learn from others' stories. And although we're based in Toronto, now that we're online since COVID, people from all over the world have been joining us for our event. So why don't you take a minute now and just type into the chat where you're joining us from today. I know we've got people from at least 2 countries. I'm joining you from Toronto in Canada. And I know Robert Bear is joining us from Oregon in the United States. We've got Vancouver, Toronto, Peterborough, Brantford, Mountain View, California. Hello, Carol. And Sudbury, Ontario. Welcome, people from all over. So the format of today's meeting, if you've not been to a Toronto Awakening Sharing Group event before, is that everybody will be muted except for the speaker and myself. And the speaker will be presenting for about an hour. That's going to be Dr. Sha'alah Ivory today. And then after that, we're going to have a question and answer period. So if you have any questions at the question and answer period, please write them into the chat. And I will be reading the questions to Sha'alah, and then she will be answering them. So let me move forward, and I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, who's Dr. Sha'alah Ivory, PhD. She has been artistic since her youth. She received training in dance from the age of 3 and in painting from the age of 8. Exploring spiritually transformative experiences and plant medicine led her to an undergraduate degree in philosophies of science and religion, perceptual neuropsychology. Wow, that's a handful. Sha'alah Ivory practiced professional midwifery. She was a midwife in Ontario, as well as in Texas. She lectured in Alexandria, Egypt, and was consultant for Warsaw, Poland's first birth center. She earned a PhD in the UK in business and law, examining pharmaceutical, malfeasance, and whistleblowing. She was an adjunct professor and guest lecturer in business ethics in Canada, the United States, and in the Netherlands. She has published articles in peer-reviewed journals and texts, but she has also studied meditation and channeling with several masters and guides. She's discovering her psychic abilities under Suzanne Giesemann's guidance, and Sha'alah currently offers readings to interested party. So I'm very happy to welcome Sha'alah Ivory.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. I'm really glad to be here and welcome everybody to what really is my coming out party. I'll tell you a little bit about my background as a kid and my introduction to all these kinds of strange perceptual realms. And I'm going to be describing 4 major spiritually transformative experiences, or STEs, and the effect that all these kinds of crossing overs have had on me right up until the present time. We'll start with my name. It describes me to a T. Sha'alah is the name given to me by one of my root teachers. And in Arabic, it means flame or flame of God. And in Hebrew, it means questioner or seeker or doubt or inquiry. My last name, I was told by a rabbi, rendered in Hebrew is Ivri, which means one who passes over or crosses over. So my name altogether means the seeker who crosses over. Very apt indeed. I was always a very precocious and active kid. I really loved everything intensely, and I questioned everything intensely, and I read a whole lot, arts, sciences, you name it. As Yvonne said, I started ballet lessons when I was 3, and it became a lifelong passion of mine, dance, and it culminating when I was 40. I was introduced to Arabic dance, and I used to dance every day for hours in this state of total bliss. And I ended up dancing sort of professionally and semi-professionally on 3 continents. Also, I've been an artist most of my life, and I've always loved, loved, loved nature, especially the wild Canadian North. It's got to be my favorite place. So 3 things have come naturally to me, albeit I didn't see anybody model these behaviors. The first was a deep belief in God and prayer. And the second, an inexhaustible thirst to know absolutely everything I could find out about world mythology. And the third was a state that I went into so easily of total concentration from when I was very wee. I was first for prayer. I was brought up mostly secular. Whenever we did go to synagogue, it was all in Hebrew, so I had no idea what was going on. But as far back as I can recall, I used to pray in my bed alone to a deity who I didn't name. And I had never seen anybody pray like this, and I had never been taught to pray like this. Now, secondly, as to mythology, I had an illustrated book of Bible stories that I really, really loved. And that book was a springboard for me to get interested in all kinds of other world mythologies and legends and fairy tales and folk tales, as much as I could find. And I emptied out pretty much 3 libraries by the time I was about 10. And 30 years later, Joseph Campbell came to the same conclusions that I did then, that all the world's religions and myths were talking about basically the same pantheon of archetypes. I just knew even then that there was something incredibly significant there, but I was too young to be able to articulate it at the time. I was a huge fantasy fan, and I used to read lots of stories about children traveling to other worlds. And in fact, at one point, I even climbed up on my parents' mantelpiece and tried to go into the other world through the mirror, just like Alice in Through the Looking Glass. One of the series that made a huge impact on me was the Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. There was a particular scene where Aslan, who's this Christ-like lion figure, encounters a warrior who has been worshiping his whole life this evil deity called Tash. But Aslan takes that warrior's worship as worship of his own divine self, because the warrior had a very pure heart and very good intentions. So C.S. Lewis and I, we really shared an understanding. I studied world religions off and on for years, and I was led to the same kind of universalist conclusions that all faiths point to the same higher power by whatever name or however many different manifestations, and that somehow, mysteriously, all the world depends on this power. I first recognized I had uncanny capacities through dreaming. One summer, I was staying in a boathouse up on Georgian Bay, and one night I had this dream of an Amazon pulling back her bow. And when I woke in the morning, I was absolutely panic-stricken. I had to phone my mother right away to find out if she was okay, and she told me she was. Well, she lied. That afternoon, she was scheduled for a radical mastectomy for breast cancer. Now, this was a mythological message, because as you could note in the statue, Amazons were said to have cut off their left breast to allow them to be better archers. So this dream was a very clear demonstration of non-locality and of a deep archetypal connection with my mother. But after I had it, I carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I've since had other numerous dreams about people's health, and also predictive ones. One night I had a dream that a Delta Wing airplane crashed to the southern horizon behind our house. And it bothered me so much, I told my kids about it at breakfast that morning. And sure enough, 2 o'clock that afternoon at the CNE air show, one of the Delta Wing planes crashed, and the CNE was south of my home. Now, as to the third natural tendency, concentration, it's always felt really natural to me, and it's manifested whether I'm studying or when I was doing midwifery. I trained myself to concentrate in sort of a strange way. In the late 60s, with all the fabulous rock and roll, I used to listen to records for hours and hours, and really, really hard when I went to concerts. And I would try and hear every single note coming together so I could see or construct in my mind how they came together to make the music that I so much enjoyed. I learned later on that this kind of focused concentration is taught in many spiritual disciplines, but I just did it because I really liked it. Often I'll concentrate to the exclusion of everything else, literally for hours, whether I'm reading or writing or when I was dancing or currently painting. And people can come and talk to me while I'm doing this. And apparently we have a conversation, but later on, I don't remember the conversations. I don't remember it happening because my mind is actually somewhere else. Now, this concentration, I think, was the basis of my fearlessness when I was a child. Recently, I had to ask my father whether this memory I had was real or not, because it was so outrageous. On a family holiday in Mexico, I remember jumping into a lagoon to grab the shell of a giant turtle, huge turtle, and go for a ride in the lagoon until the point where the turtle started to go down to the outlet to the open sea, at which point I let go. I mean, I can't even believe that that happened. Talk about an animal totem. But my dad said, yeah, that happened. And he and mom just stood on the side and they thought, well, you're a really good swimmer. It'll be fine. Now, after that happened, of course, we all behaved as if nothing extraordinary had happened. This was what, par for the course? I'm not really sure. Now, this kind of fearlessness actually would often come most into play on others' behalf. Sometimes I jump into action without any thought for myself at all. And here's the thing, this lack of fear was a result, I think, of perceiving more than and differently than is normal, and that this strange mode of perception automatically included a very powerful moral component that was irresistible. And here's an example from my mid-teens. I went to babysit this little girl, about 3 years old, with her older cousin, who was my friend, and her beau. And at one point, we decided to go for a ride in the car. Now, this is before the seat belts were mandatory. So we got in the car, my friend and her beau up front, and I sat in the back with a little girl. And at one point, the car was turning to the right, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw these two little legs tumbling out of the car. And before I even had the time to understand what it was I was seeing, I had thrown myself out of the car. I grabbed onto the door handle. I remember my legs banging against the roadway. I rolled. I somehow managed to pick this little girl up and throw her onto the grass beside the road. And all these cars came screeching to a halt, inches from me. I realized afterwards I hadn't had a single thought for my own safety. There hadn't even been time. And then after that, we all carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. These kinds of things used to happen from time to time. I saved a fair number of kids from drowning or from cracking their heads open, and also had these sorts of experiences when I was a midwife. Most striking about all of them was the complete lack of conscious decision-making involved. Instead, there was this kind of hyper-focus and a warping of time that somehow seemed to catapult me into action before the crisis had even arisen. It felt like an automatic response. There was no urgency to it, just this choiceless awareness. I was completely focused on the recipient. There was no room for any ego at all in that. One time when I was a midwife, I was at a birth in Texas, and I was just there taking notes. I was the junior in the room. And the midwife hesitated because the baby's head was born and then its shoulders got jammed up, which can happen, and it's an emergency. And I remember the room becoming very still and the father starting to pray very loudly. Now, he was a lay pastor in this big Pentecostal church. And then there was this sound as of wings rushing all around the room. And apparently, I had this break in consciousness. And apparently I climbed up on the bed. I flipped this mother over about 280 pounds under her hands and knees. And I didn't sort of come into awareness of what I was doing until my hands were already well up inside her and I was disengaging the baby. Now, he was born and he was fine after a few puffs of mouth to mouth. And afterwards, the dad said that the Holy Spirit had been in the room to save his son. Later, I just, in my own memory, I set aside the sound of those wings and the break in my consciousness, and I carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I've always felt like there's been two minds in me, one that functions on the outside world and one in the inner. And for a long time, I attributed having access to these strange realms as just being part of artistic, an artistic temperament, an artistic imagination. And it was this belief that allowed me to keep going without taking undue note of these experiences. It was very handy in my early teens. On the outside, I was this really wild child experimenting with all kinds of drugs and having hallucinogenic insights and hanging out with very fringe social circles. But on the inside, I was this dedicated scholar trying to figure out what the blazes was going on, what was the meaning of all this. And so I ended up studying psychology and physiology, philosophy and logic and mysticism in an effort to find the answer to this. Eventually, however, I had to give up on academics because the professors didn't know any more than I did. And unlike their knowledge, mine was mostly firsthand. So instead, I just did the normal thing. I fell in love, I got married, and I raised a house full of kids. But when I was a young mother, the visions persisted. When I was about 4 months pregnant with my first child, I had a dream where there was this place of dark water. It reminded me of the second verse in Genesis, where it says, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And in the distance was this being, and here was me, and we were sort of see-through beings. And at each of our elbows was an angel carrying us flying towards each other. And when we passed one another, there was this amazing acknowledgement, very grave and very joyous. And when I woke up, I knew that I'd met my son. During his labor, I saw myself as a Valkyrie on the mountaintop, waving this thunderbolt because I was going to split the heavens to allow him to enter our world. But these gifts could also pose difficulties. Even though I looked fearless on the outside, denying what I can sense outside the norm caused me tremendous anxiety. I was painfully afraid of the dark because of half-sensed, half-imagined beings in all these dim corners. I used to see colors, I used to see auras, I would see foreign landscapes kind of overlaid on what was objectively in front of me. I have experienced my consciousness riding in my body like someone riding in a carriage. I've seen out of other people's eyes or felt their feelings, and I could never explain any of these sensations or the very intense emotions that very often accompanied them. And it was very confusing. Sometimes the same thing would be terrifying or enchanting. Like I could be running by a cemetery at night one time with my hand up, trying not to see, holding my breath. And then the next day, getting on my bike, going for a ride through the same cemetery and sort of peeking around to see if there were any spirits hanging around in the bushes or beside the various monuments. But I couldn't tell a single soul recently, really, until recently. Sorry. I thought that it might be a form of madness, and it frightened me, not what I was sensing, but the fact that I was actually aware of it. And I remember asking my best friend a couple of times if she thought I was crazy. Now, as to the madness, I did my usual, and I researched a lot about the history of psychiatry and medicine. But I came to a conclusion after all of that, that the experts really are just kind of guessing. They don't really know what's happening. And I figured as long as I could fit in and function relatively well in the world, did it really matter that my inner life was so wild and so full? I thought it was a moot point. And then I had my first really big STE. In her 40s, my mother studied for a while under a Sahaj yoga teacher who was a disciple of Ramana Maharshi. And she offered this weekend enlightenment intensive. And for some reason, I went instead of my mother. I think it had to do with the fact I'd been at home for a while as a mom, and I was all involved in baby chores and quite socially isolated. I felt it was a good opportunity to kind of get back to who I was. So for 3 straight days and nights, we asked, who am I? with an intent to directly experience the one who we were. So for a couple of days, after drilling down through all these social roles and these personality traits, I had my first utterly transformative spiritual experience. I was sitting face to face with a partner telling her who I was, and I'd been seeing lights and auras around things that were increasing for the last couple of days. And then all of a sudden, they're on this rising tide of joy and wonder that I'd never experienced before. The whole world just dissolved into this matrix of vibration or light flowing downwards into this infinite vortex of light. It was amazing. It was more real than real, in the same way that reality is more real than dreams. And I yelled out loud, I said, "Is this who I am? Is this what I am?" When I came across the movie a few years later, The Matrix, I was very much reminded of a scene where Neo decodes the Matrix, and this is the image that he sees. Various Hindu authors have talked about this state as being one of the last stages of what they call Sabakalpya Samadhi. And it's an indescribable, undeniable experience of the oneness of reality from a completely different mental perspective. Now, I spoke to the yoga teacher about it because part of the experience was this feeling that somehow I was supposed to cultivate this so that I could be there and here at the same time. But when I spoke to her, it didn't do any good because she hadn't had this experience. I spoke to several people about it, but basically got the response of, go away, you're talking nonsense, or you're making this up, or you're exaggerating it. So I had no guidance as to how to integrate this into my life. And so I carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. This taught me, though, something very important, that there is far more going on here than meets the eye. And there's far more happening than everyday science will even permit us to consider. Apparently, the ancient traditions of yoga and meditation that I'd studied in university actually do provide access to these other realms, but most people either don't have the time, or they don't have the interest, or they've never had any experience, so they don't really care about all of this. So I got along with my life, and I had 3 babies at home with midwives, and I got involved in 2 decades of political activism supporting natural childbirth. And I had a compulsion to learn absolutely everything I could find out about birthing babies. Something in me really wanted to give back what I'd learned from my midwives. And this magical process unfolded. I would just go from step to step, effortlessly, easily, in a very orderly fashion. People would come to me and ask for help, and I'd share with them whatever it was I knew, and I would learn more along the way. And after 7 years of this, I discovered I was a practicing midwife. And then provincial midwifery got legislated. And with that, I became registered as a professional midwife in Ontario, and also at the same time in the United States. Now, at this time I started midwifery practice, we honored all kinds of belief systems. The book of the 1980s was this book called Spiritual Midwifery, and it was kind of a common sense clinical manual that supported spiritual practice because it led to a reduction in fear, which leads to a smoother physiologic process and an increased access to intuitive knowledge. We used to get invited to blessing ways and christenings, and I worked for a number of months in a Christian birth house with spirit-led midwives in Texas. So the approach that I developed was spiritually oriented. It wasn't mechanistic, it wasn't codifiable. And to solid science, because I'm a huge fan of science, scientific method, I added this kind of intuition that was not easy to foster. However, as the 1990s moved on, with midwifery being professionalized more and more, it became just another kind of defensive medical practice. And it only accepted really formulaic protocols. So as I was feeling more and more this inner need to act out of truth, not convention, there started to open this widening chasm between myself and my work colleagues. Unfortunately, spirituality had become a dirty word. And the reason that I'd been drawn to midwifery practice in the first place had become complete anathema. Too often I found myself acting against what was officially prescribed, and because I would feel forced into it by this inner intuition that absolutely brooked no objection at all. And so eventually I got forced out of the profession. At the exact same time, I was being invited to give lectures and extended seminars to groups overseas. I was teaching, for example, spiritually oriented low-tech birth practice to a group of nurses and doctors and midwives in Warsaw, Poland. I also taught in Alexandria, Egypt, and in Nepal. I shared all these techniques of what I would call laser-like spiritual wisdom added on to common obstetrical praxis. So while I was being hosted and lauded as a VIP overseas, I was being blacklisted at home for precisely the same behaviors. I couldn't understand why I couldn't resist this inner impulse to act, even when I knew it was going to put my job in jeopardy. So that led to being the topic of my doctoral dissertation. I interviewed several whistleblowers in medicine, mostly people tilting against the windmills of big pharma. And what I saw is that we all had the same urge to act for others, to fight for others, even when our careers were at stake. So I framed this whole thing as a sort of a perceptual awareness that came along automatically with a very strong moral structure. And my research showed that this urge came not from the individual. So it wasn't a matter of just deciding or controlling. It came from transpersonal realms, whether we would or not. Now, while immersed in motherhood and midwifery at the age of 31, I had an emotional crisis. And in order to recover from this, I had to start engaging in the spiritual practice that I kind of let go for about 5 years after my STE. And so I began to pray and to meditate a lot daily. And I believe that this is what produced my second major STE. One day I was meditating in my little wee bathtub, and I found myself suddenly speaking the word Hineni, which apparently I found out later in Hebrew means I am here. And it's what Moses said when he came across the burning bush. I felt myself falling backwards into this tunnel of darkness. And I distinctly remember deciding to keeping on going this because I was just really curious as to what would come next. It reminded me of Alice falling down her rabbit hole. There were faces and objects and scenes as we sort of floated down. And then I landed gently on whatever was the bottom of this place. And I was surrounded by this bright, bright white light with a being of some sort in the midst of it. But more than this, much more, was the feeling of being absolutely loved, total contentment, what I'd been looking for my whole life. I was enwrapped by love. It was under, over, through me. Just as atoms are said to make up the physical universe, in this place, love made up the universe. I was also drifting sort of fearlessly. It was wonderful. And at the same time, very grounded and very stable. And while this was going on, I remember thinking to myself, oh my goodness, this is biblical. This might be heaven. This might be looking out of the eyes of a higher power, or the consciousness with a higher power, the one that was everything. And yet, at the same time, I knew that this whole experience was one tiny, tiny, infinitesimally tiny jot of the immensity of the reality of this love. I couldn't have said how I felt this because I didn't really have a body at this point. I only was aware of a center of my field of perception that were kind of where my eyes would have been if I'd had any at that point. After a few moments, I turned my attention to the being. Now, it was too bright to really see a face or a body, but from the light that was kind of coruscating off this figure, I thought it was a man of light. I don't know why I thought it was a male entity. And then I heard his voice in my mind. And this tone was clear. It was ringing. It was gorgeous. I have a thing for men's voices. And this one was non pareil. I was sort of embarrassed because the first thing out of my mouth, or from my mind to his, was, "Who are you? Are you Jesus?" And his voice exploded in my head. He was laughing and laughing, and he said, "If you like." I was scandalized and absolutely delighted at the response. I knew he was teasing me. And with that laughter came like a ticket to ride. All the questions I'd been carrying for years poured out of me all at once. Questions about birth and death and love and purpose and God and the universe and rationality and space-time and fractals and infinity and so on. All these questions just came cascading out as if they were just one great gush of inquiry, very pointed, very precise, but encompassing all my questions at once. And then we were off because he was showing me, not telling me the answers. He drew me with this weird kind of gentle warmth, like a very familiar touch from people I loved, like my children. And we started, I understood that time and space worked very, very differently there. And there was no sense of movement of air or anything else against me, but whole vistas kind of moved past us, or we moved through them. It was kind of like when you're in a train and there's another train beside you and one of them starts to move and you don't know which one it actually is at first. The whole thing felt like that. We went through eons of time. We went through the center of the earth. We started where all the elements were, very, very bright and hot. We zoomed out to over the earth, and I could see below us all these vistas of forests and mountains and rivers and lakes and oceans. It was amazing. And then beyond that, we went past the moon, past the planets, right out of the solar system to the very edge of the galaxy. And then beyond that into this indescribable space, unbelievable space where every tiny spot of light represented billions of stars. And we passed through eons of time. We went back beyond the Big Bang many times before. We started in the way, way past, moved into the present, and then into the future. And every single moment, included an infinity of chains of events that branched off into separate universes, as if every moment in every spot there could be something, a variation slightly different, so a different tone, color, temperature, extension, and something maybe similar or something completely different, so that the whole chain of events would branch off into a separate universe. And it was like the butterfly effect, but multiplied asymptotic to infinity. I knew that in this place, time was malleable, and therefore also space, and that all of this mysteriously somehow was happening all at once in some unfathomable way, and that it was this great love that was fueling all of this. It was all life. It filled all life and drew all life to it. And all these universes were conjoined in some magnificent and mysterious way that allowed you actually to navigate between them. So we went on our trip way out, way out in the utter reaches of this universe, but there was more. There were strange realms where words were absolutely useless because nothing I saw corresponded to anything that I knew of on Earth. Light worked differently there, maybe different wavelengths carrying form in it. And these kingdoms were of all different kinds. They were light and dark. Some of them were formed, some formless. Some of them were joyous, and some of them kind of ominous. All manner of realities, but they were so far beyond my imagination as to be barely perceivable. I glimpsed just a little bit of these worlds, and yet often I understood them conceptually or abstractly. And not just the environments, but the beings that lived in them were utterly foreign and fascinating. And their emotional and perceptual ranges only intersected with earthly ranges at one tiny point. I recognize several of them, I think, from dreams and meditations, but most of them are completely strange and new. Now, after what could have been ages or seconds, I reached a point where I felt like I was going to explode. I was just filled to bursting, and I couldn't sustain any more of this bliss, this energy, this information. I was completely stuffed. And so I said to my friend, I'm so sorry. I just can't absorb anymore. I don't have the strength. I might have been wrong. I don't know. I'll find out later. And when I said this, he didn't reproach me. There was no sense of disappointment coming from him, but I was quite distressed at my own limitations, because I knew, even though I would return eventually, the prospect of leaving this was so incredibly sad, leaving that amazing awareness and that sense of being enveloped by love behind. But at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. And before I left, I had one last question that went something like, yes, I see, I understand now how more or less all of this works, but what do I do? I don't know what to do with this in my own life. And the answer was clear. It does not matter at all what you do. Whatever brings you closer to this state is what you should do. And with that, I tumbled swoosh back up into my body, into my bathtub of cold water by that time. And immediately I ran into my bedroom, and I'm jumping up and down and telling my husband what happened. And this is when I was faced with why coming out wasn't necessarily advisable. This man, who supposedly knew me better than anybody else, he listened, and then he remarked dismissively, cool. He was not interested in the import or the implication of this. I knew with that these experiences could not be shared with people either who hadn't had any or who had no interest in the possibility of there being any. So I took this amazing experience, I hid it way deep in my heart, and I carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But after meeting that endless love, I can tell you I have missed it profoundly, disturbingly ever since. And I once heard an experiencer suggesting that the reason not a lot of us cross over is that us humans, we're pretty sensitive, and that we might suffer such homesickness, it would cripple us. And I can attest to some of that. Now, even though I had cited Bruce Grayson's work in a paper a few years prior, it didn't twig that STE had 22 out of 24 of the hallmarks that Bruce Grayson, in his research on near-death experiences, said was characteristic of those experiences. And I didn't connect the dots until 30 years later. And when I finally put it together, I approached some NDE-focused YouTubers to talk about it, but they weren't interested unless I died. And even now, it seems really strange to me that it takes the drama of the proximity to death for most Westerners to even admit that such things are possible. Never mind that Eastern and Western mystics and sages have been talking about these things literally for millennia. But at least now, people are starting to listen to them and not dismiss them out of hand. Now, after this STE, I think there was some emotional fallout. Acknowledging the unseen and its relation to us as mediated by love began to make my internal moral impulses so loud that the urge to serve became really overwhelming. It's possible that because of daily meditative practices, as the New Age types would say, I think I was beginning to vibrate at a higher frequency. I felt more willing and more hopeful, despite every day being slammed up against the loss of spirituality from my work life. So while my work life was slowly being poisoned, my inner life was developing in leaps and bounds. And during this decade, I kept stumbling into Tibetan Buddhist teachings. Little did I know that I was being set up to meet a great teacher. It began with a psychic reading I was gifted from a friend, because I never would have gone to one otherwise. And the entity channeled by the medium insisted that crossing over STE was a gift that was designed to encourage me to keep going with my explorations. He also said that the man of light I had encountered was a Tibetan Lama, my inner guru. Now, at that point, I didn't know anything about Tibetan teachings, but it certainly sparked my interest. So that I read the book called Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. And in it, he lays out all the basic tenets of Buddhist philosophy and some practices. And it was the first time I had encountered what I felt was a reconciliation of human suffering with disease and death with a very powerful moral framework. So this book really affected me quite profoundly. A month later, a group of Tibetan monks came to Convocation Hall to sing. And the promo in the newspaper said, if you listened really intently, you could hear these harmonics that sounded like whale sounds. And I thought to myself, oh yes, I know how to listen intently. So off we went to the concerts, and we sat way up high in the gods where you could see the whole room. And it was a big round area, a big dome. And sure enough, we heard the harmonics, the whale music, way up high, and the people singing way down low. And at one point, I closed my eyes just to concentrate a little bit more. And when I opened them, holy moly, the whole place was lit up under an umbrella of golden light. And I told my husband, I said, do you see that? Do you see that? But he didn't respond. When we were leaving, I felt like I was floating down the stairs. The whole place was still limned in gold everywhere I looked. When we did get home and I told him what I saw again, he wasn't interested. So we just got on with more mundane matters and carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And then I read the book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. Sorry, we already mentioned that. In that book, one of the things that really struck me was the fact that they talked about you had to have a teacher. If you didn't have the right teacher, you couldn't reach full spiritual development. So I began to pray for that quite earnestly. And it produced, I think, my third major STE. One day, this woman, she phoned me out of the blue. She was the home nurse for my mom who'd had surgery. And at my mother's house, she's noticed on the wall, there was a chart of Hindu chakras. Now, my mother had long since ceased to do any yogic practice. And so when the woman said, would you be interested in meeting my teacher? My mom said, well, I'm not interested, but my daughter might be. And so she gave the woman my phone number. So this lady called me and said, would I like to meet her teacher? And I thought to myself, oh, who is this crackpot? And Mom, what do you think you're doing? Giving this lady my phone number. But I declined her, as politely as I could. No, thank you. Now, 2 days later, I was meditating with a very good friend. We'd been doing some spiritual exploration together. And recently we'd been doing some exercises that were supposed to set you up to be able to channel, just to see if we could do it. And it made you very receptive so that stuff would come in from whatever other dimensions. And this was our first chance to get together after a month of preparation to actually try it out. And I was the seer first. And so I was supposed to, we would meditate together, and then I'd report whatever it was I was sensing. Now, it began with a vision in my mind's eye of a strange world. It had pink grass and an aqua sky and sort of mauve river. And there was this dwarf-like being who was doing cartwheels by the side of this river. And he was very jovial, very comical. He reminded me of the Egyptian god Bes, who is said to assist women in childbirth. And then that faded and everything got dark. And the closest thing on earth to what I experienced next was like when you're way up north in the Arctic and you see the northern lights. It starts with a glow at the horizon that then grows and then domes over the entire sky. Well, so too this began with a horizon of golden light that then grew to completely envelop my field of vision. And then I opened my eyes, and it was still the same. I could only see thousands of tiny overlapping golden scales, each of which had a heart that was sort of rose-colored or peach-colored. I couldn't see or feel my body or the room, but I could hear my voice. And best of all, there was this beautiful surge of warmth all over, and joy and a peacefulness I'd never experienced before. And I was utterly entranced by this. But then I heard my friend's voice snapping out this order. Whatever you're doing, shut it down. Now, she sounded really frightened. So I don't know how I did it, but I managed to shut it down. And as this vision faded, I was once more in my body in the room. While I'd been having a lovely time, she was having a terrible time. She felt like she was shriveling up, as if she was aging really, really rapidly. When I floated home that day, I was really pondering to myself what this all meant. And the very next day, that nurse phoned me again. She said, my teacher is teaching tonight. Would you like to come and see him? And this time I said, of course, because I thought maybe this fellow could throw some light on what it was that had just happened to me. Who knew? So that evening, I found myself amongst a crowd of folk sitting on the floor without our shoes on. All the shoes were at the door. And we were waiting for the Lama. His name was Namgyal Rinpoche. He was this very tall, very imposing Western guy who arrived on this wave of excitement and affection, actually. And he launched right into a talk on the 14 factors of enlightenment, the first two of which are curiosity and ecstatic absorption. So he hooked me right there. He also used examples from things that I had always been interested in as well: physiology and psychology and mythology and folk tales and proverbs. And so I understood all his references, and I really liked his jokes. It was great fun. And then he sat up very tall. He said, anybody have any questions? And everybody else in the room sort of stopped breathing. I didn't know why, but I understood later that because sometimes when you ask him a question, he was just as likely to be furious as he was to be friendly. But I didn't know that. I saw his gaze go over the room, and then it came to land on my face. So I stuck my hand up and he nodded. And so I thanked him for his lovely talk and apologized for this being a little bit off topic, and then asked him to if he could shed any light on this STE that he described to me. And this slow smile spread across his face, and he sat up very tall. He looked at me and he said, this was the diamond baptism, and it means I was supposed to study more. And he arranged with the nurse who brought me that I would come to him. And a month later, we got together, and he took me on as a student right there. And we started, I got meditation instructions, and I had to provide him with weekly meditation reports. Apparently, this kind of introduction was quite unusual. I asked him at some point why I didn't have to go through all the preliminaries to this kind of study. And he said, it's because you've done them before. I didn't know if he meant in this life or a different life. But 10 years later, I read a transcribed lecture of his teaching on STE, and this is what he said. You cannot heal until you are a very pure being, clean of any ego power games. The two sure signs of transcendental healing are warmth and a rose peach light. The heart's warmth spreads a total rose glow, and joy adds a golden peach. The 11th stage of insight practice brings total healing, followed by the experience of the transcendental. So that's how he described what I had gone through. Now, my training under his tutelage was very joyous and very demanding, but there was more. As I began to work with him, I also met my other teacher, the choreographer Samya Mene, and she led me into a physical discipline of heart-centered, sacred geometry-based Arabic dance, which was my passion for the next 15 years. And these two directions, one perfectly physical, one perfectly mental, acted as a spiritual counterbalance for all the difficulties I was having in my professional and personal life. And following Namgyal's instructions, in short order, I had another major STE. I was attending a retreat on shunyata, or emptiness. And during one of his lectures, I was listening in the way that I do, really intently, trying to wrap my head around the meaning of the words he was using to describe the differentiation between subject and predicate, and why it was impossible to delineate where self ends and not self begins. And I was trying to formulate a question. I started to ask, I said, he said, no. I was stopped dead in my thinking by that retort. So I kind of regrouped and tried again. And I said, we, and he said, no. I understand later that what this was is a koan. And he had described a koan at one point as end of speech. He must have known precisely what was going on in my head because he used it to catapult me into a totally different state of consciousness. I felt again this tsunami of consciousness coming up, and I laughed and I said to him, "Hey, I might as well shut up now." And he howled. He just howled. The change in consciousness, it was as powerful and as terrible as a bolt of lightning. And in front of 40 students in the temple, I turned to my husband and I said, "Here I go." And this wave crested. It carried me away on a flood of nirvikalpa samadhi. This time, I became completely unaware of normal surroundings and was simply witness to a panorama of lights and colors and vortices and unbelievably beautiful patterns in these moving vortices of light that filled the whole field of perception. And in this field, I, as a being, did not exist, but I was merely part of this dancing, expanding, and contraction of light. Everything felt absurdly, infinitely funny, like I was in the middle of this huge cosmic joke. And people looking from the outside must have thought, what's got into her? Because I was laughing my head off and slowly but surely sliding down onto the floor of the temple, and some kind person put a pillow under my head. Apparently Namjal said, "Oh, she'll be fine." And he carried on with his lecture. Now I came back to normal consciousness half an hour, 45 minutes later, when he was finishing up his lecture. Now, I went on to have many more meditational visions, but always went back to carrying on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. However, over time, my practice flagged as I got sucked deeper and deeper into political quagmires at work and the late stage convulsions of my marriage of 25 years. And then there came a dark night of the soul. All my STEs did not seem to help me make the transition out of my marriage, out of my profession, out of my home, out of my mind. I sometimes wonder, actually, if being sensitive to these other realms actually made that kind of passage more painful, more difficult, because I was so much more open to the emotional waves that were involved in all these and couldn't cut them off. I'm not really sure. But for a time, the mind in me, the one that traversed spiritual dimensions, just receded. And I struggled to rebuild my life. I moved to the country, away from the cities, which is what I'd wanted for a very long time. I did some teaching, and my second husband and I, we built a little house on the river where I studied for my MA and my PhD. And we carried on, but on a very sort of a mundane level. And it wasn't until my husband died in 2019 that my latent spiritual life picked way up again. His death at home was very peaceful, it was very loving, it was very calm. I was a huge supporter of home birth, and symmetrically a supporter of home death. It just seemed to be right where it's possible to me. And at his funeral, called on every spiritual tradition that we knew to send him on his way. And we covered his body in flowers and poured incense and perfume into the graveside. I was totally overwhelmed by grief. I had this chapter of grief that began a few years earlier with the death of my younger brother. And when I first saw his body lying in the coffin, I was dismayed that I threw my head back and called out very, very loudly, "Adam, where are you?" Because somehow, absolutely, I knew that if he wasn't in the body, he was somewhere else. In only a few years since then, I have lost first my brother, my best friend, my mother, my husband, and more recently, my father, and only a few months ago, my surviving brother. And all this death has made me look very, very carefully again at what I actually believe and what these STEs actually mean. When my husband died, there arose again a veritable cornucopia of signs from these other dimensions. 2 days after his death, a hospice volunteer and I were sitting in my sunroom, and within a couple of minutes, a complete rainbow of birds an orange oriole, a blue indigo bunting, a red-winged blackbird, a yellow goldfinch, a ruby-throated hummingbird, a rose-breasted grosbeak, and none of them with a partner, with a female, which in itself is almost impossible. They assembled literally inches away from the window. And we were both bird fans, and we knew how rare, how improbable this was. And so we figured it was just a message from my husband, who knew I love birds. A week later, I distinctly felt him wrap himself around me in bed one morning and whisper in my ear, "How are you?" I was instantly wide awake, but I didn't move. And I just said, "I'm okay so far, but just stay, don't go, don't go." And so this hug from beyond lasted for a few minutes and then faded, leaving me in tears, both of grief and gratitude. I got another phone call from beyond several days later. And this one, I picked up one of those old-fashioned bell phones, the big old black ones that everybody used to have, and which made sense. It was a phone call from my husband. He used to work for Bell, and so he was working as a Bell guy at the time that those phones were pretty much standard equipment. And when I picked up the phone, it was his voice, absolutely without question. Now, I can challenge people that they can bring to mind what things look like, but to actually remember somebody's voice without hearing it is very, very difficult. So it was his voice, no question, with his signature, "Hi, babe," starting. And he started to tell me all about where he was and how fabulous it was. And I listened and made comments. It was exactly the same as when he'd been alive. When one of us used to go on a trip, we would phone the other one and we'd tell them all about what was going on and where we were and how great it was. And the other person would listen. So it was the same scenario. At one point, he was absolutely over the top enthusiastic. He said, "It's a new life, Sha'alah. No, you don't understand. A whole new life." Now, a few months later, a friend told me about a local medium who's supposed to be really good. And so I got her to come. We did a reading, and she was amazing. Not only did she pick up on his total shamelessness, she had her head in her hand. She said, "I've never had a spirit come to me naked before." I thought, that's my husband. Oh, God. And she came over to kneel in front of me. She said, "He's telling me to do this." And she opened and shut her eyes several times, very slowly. And at that, I burst into tears. I knew he was there. This was something he and I used to call pussycat eyes. When we were out in public, if we were across a room, to say "I love you" to the other person, we would do pussycat eyes to each other. And nobody knew this, nobody. So this reading marked the beginning of my fascination with mediums in the afterlife, and me being me, I just read whatever I could get my hands on. And I signed up for a course with the evidential medium Suzanne Giesman in the hope that I would come closer to my husband. But instead, it opened me up to all my own psychic and mediumistic facilities. And it unfolded this way. At one point, we had a breakout session with just a few students, and we were going to try reading and see what happened and report it to the other students. And I thought ahead of time, I'm not going to be able to do this, but I will lend my energy as well as I'm able. But surprise, things came up right away. I heard the word beekeeping and then picking mushrooms. And then I saw a scene of running down a stream bed in a wood of pine and birch. And I had these hairy legs that belonged to a young man, and I had boots on and khaki shorts. And one of the students went, "Oh, that's my father-in-law." Apparently he died a few months prior, and he had been a beekeeper, and she and he used to go picking mushrooms in the woods together. And then I asked her, "Is there any connection with Poland here?" Because the woods reminded me of the woods I'd seen outside Warsaw when I was there. And she said, "Yes, he was born in Poland." Now, in a few practice readings with other people, all kinds of evidence would come up when we would ask for it. And then a friend invited me to a gallery reading on Zoom, where a medium was doing a whole lot of people at once. And this one woman started to ask a question, and I suddenly had this very vivid image of a cross section of a brain stem drooping down into a spinal cord. And I thought to myself, this is a diagram of Chiari malformation. Screen, please. Thanks. So we sent this woman a chat message, and had she ever been diagnosed with Chiari? We both saw her go quite pale, and she messaged back and she said, yes, she just had an MRI that gave her that diagnosis. Now, this syndrome is quite rare and even more rarely diagnosed. It's usually incidentally to other diagnostic procedures. So I sent her my phone number and offered to do a reading if she was interested, which she was, and we got together. I went to her home. It turns out she was a retired nurse. So the first part of the reading was quite technical. We talked shop about diagnoses and treatments to account for certain anomalies in her physical being. And then I also saw scenes of her childhood as an equestrian, her current lover, and so forth. And she validated that all these details were real. Then her friend who was in the other room, she popped her head and she said, can I have one? And an impromptu reading. And I thought, sure, why not? Let's give it a go. So she sat down, and immediately I saw painful teeth and work done on them. A pain in her gut, could have been intestinal, could have been urinary tract. I saw her down on the floor playing with children's blocks, trying to build a structure, and a man's boots coming in and knocking them around. This voice came out of my face. It said, get up off the floor. And then it said, Jeff cares for you and will help. And she looked at me and she said, you're good, very good. She'd had jaw surgery just prior. She'd been dismissing a pain in her gut. She thought it was just nerves. She was in an abusive marriage where she wanted children and her husband didn't. And a friend she'd been on the phone with that very morning, who she hadn't talked to for about 10 years, who said he would help her deal with this toxic situation. And his name was Jeff. It wasn't until this point that I saw absolutely and had to accept that I had access to information that was otherwise hidden. Since I've met several guides and spirits who have showed me that I've acted on these talents for many years, and that all my work to date has been enhanced by them. I was shown that my writing is channeled, my dancing was channeled, my painting is channeled. Since these first sessions, I've read many other people and have received detailed instructions for remedies, even when I didn't think it would happen. Recently, I was in a very crowded restaurant with a friend I'd known my whole life. And when I was telling her about this stuff, she was very skeptical. And she said, oh, yeah? So bring in my father. He died a few months before. So noisy restaurant and her doubt. I'm going, I don't know if this is going to work or not. But I thought, well, go ahead. And sure enough, there he was, smiling. He's on a barge on a canal in Central Europe somewhere. And he's telling me to show her. He's pulling on his ear like this. And so I said, he's telling me to show you pulling on your ear like this. And her expression went from one that was doubtful to one that was amazed. She said her dad had done this so much during his life that he'd had to have surgery on his ear. And no one in his family knew that at all. Now, beyond individuals, I received downloads from ancestors and groups of ancestors from long ago. For one seeker who was looking for help with a digestive problem, I saw a house on the edge of a dark wood, and it was from the 1800s maybe, and there were very plump dirndl-wearing women in this house and some very brawny men, and the women were serving black sour bread and fermented cabbages and fermented beets. And they were telling me that this sitter needed to eat more fermented food. Now, his name was a German name, so I thought maybe it was somewhere in Germany. And then the word Silesia floated right across my field of perception. Neither of us knew where this was, so we had to look it up. It was in an area on the border between Poland and Germany that was contested back and forth for many years. And sure enough, even though his name was German, his family identifies as Polish. For another sitter whose last name was Irish or Scottish, I saw a Danish sailor from 300 years ago, and he's bragging that he had invented this thing called a rudder windlass. Now, neither she nor I had any idea what a rudder windlass was. In fact, we discovered it was a device that was developed in the 18th century that absolutely revolutionized seagoing trade. It made it possible to steer much, much bigger ships. And then she revealed to me that she was, in fact, of Danish extraction. Since then, I've been privileged to engage in quite a few evidentially supported readings, and more the emphasis seems to be placed on ancestors coming through, not just recent people who've passed, but people from long ago. It's just fascinating to me. At one point, there was a fellow who was of Mayan background, and again, the words Palenque and Tulum heralding this amazing vision of Mayan life 1,000 years ago was right there. Then we talked about that. It was just wonderful. Now, these days, my spirit guides told me very clearly that I was to establish a website. So I have done so. I'm a good student. I do what I'm told. And I'm supposed to share their teachings and philosophical musings, the ones that I used to think were my own, but apparently aren't so much, and to present my channeled works of art and other drawings. And also it's where people who would like to can contact me for a reading. And the last thing that I've been working on most recently, I've got several books in the works, one of which is going to be a spiritual autobiography, and I'll be seeking a publisher for that, I hope, this coming summer. Now, that's all for my story today. And thank you so much for listening. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions that my story may have caused you to have. Thanks.
Thank you, Sha'alah. Thank you for that really, really incredible presentation. I'm so glad that Toronto Awakening Sharing Group could give you your coming out opportunity to share your profound experiences. I wanted to tell you one thing before we get to the questions. So those of you, please put your questions for Sha'alah in the chat. I'll start by asking a couple of my own questions and comments, and then I'll start reading your questions as you write them in the chat. But how I, having researched spiritually transformative experiences and near-death experiences for 40 years, have come to frame a near-death experience is that it's a mystical experience or out-of-body experience that happens to occur when you're close to death. But of course, you know, and you've experienced, and you gave us beautiful examples of profound mystical experiences that happened when you were not close to death. And in fact, my research has shown that many more people have them when they're not close to death as compared to ones that are near death. But that's the one that's getting all the publicity, is the mystical experiences that happen when you're close to death. So yeah, absolutely. And that's why you checked all the boxes, because he was actually describing mystical experiences. And yes, that is true. So I think that's really wonderful. And I'm so glad that the term spiritually transformative experiences was helpful for you. Now, we have a number of questions coming up. So let me start with the first one here. Carol wants to know, you spelled Grayson correctly, Greyon. Which of Bruce Grayson's books or articles it is that you recommend when you say that you referenced him? Do you have one particular one that you recommend for Carol Ann?
I can't remember the name of the title, but I know it was an entire volume. It wasn't just a study or an article. I'm sorry, I don't recall the name of it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you Google Bruce Grayson, spelled Greyon, his books will come up.
And if you like to look at his articles, if you go onto Google Scholar and Google his name, there'll be lots of articles there from journals.
Yeah. His most recent book is called After, that he just put out about a year ago. Okay. Now we have a comment and a question from Carol. And Carol says, so beautiful. Thank you. Sorry for your losses. What is your opinion about envisioning an assistive to healing, for example, when meditating? Let me read that again. What is your opinion about envisioning as assistive to healing, for example, when meditating? Okay, I guess that's visualizing. She's saying, is visualizing helpful for healing? I think that's what that question means.
And visual, absolutely. I think, she said yes. I think that being able to imagine in great detail is very, very helpful in terms of one's spiritual progress, as well as being able to actualize things in your life if you're trying to have them manifest. If you look at Tibetan tradition, all the tantric tradition, what that teaches is through using all kinds of visualization procedures with thousands of different deities, each one, if carried forward very clearly, sets up a different mental state. And it trains your mind to be able to be so sharp and to be able to see entire pantheons at once with a central figure and other figures and things on the figures and light and so on and so on and so forth. The idea is to train your mind to be able to visualize. And there's some kind of connection between having a mind that can do that and having a mind that can actually access energy from other dimensions.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you, Sha'alah. I have a question for you too. Is why do you think, now that you've had years to reflect upon it, why do you think it took you until your adult years, until recently, to realize that you've been, in fact, having STEs and you've had these intuitive or psychic gifts since you were a child, it sounds like?
Yeah. I think the reason for that has to do with the notion of safety. There had to be two prerequisites before I would feel safe to come out. One was in the external world. If I'd started talking about this stuff 20 years ago, I would have ended up in the Clark. I think it would have been taken as evidence that I was mentally unstable, and I would have not been able to get any credibility at all around it. But things have changed significantly in the last couple of decades. And the other side of it has to do with my protection against dissolution of the ego. I think also that 30 years ago, my ego self, the one who I am in this world, was not strong enough to sustain these kinds of experiences on an ongoing basis. It seems to me that in order to be able to voyage out, just like if you're going to be visiting, part of the world where there's weird diseases and things, and you need to get your shots before you go, and you need to make sure that you have access to clean water, you need to strengthen the ego in order to make these kinds of traverses. And that means dealing with trauma, past trauma, it has to be cleared. Dealing with arrogance, that has to be dealt with so that you don't have any pride associated with this stuff. And dealing with a certain open-mindedness that to my mind is the absolute key to this. If you're completely open, every time this stuff comes up, it's just like Monty Python. And now for something completely different. So you have to get beyond the point where you think you know what's going to happen. And this is one of the things I have trouble with, is a lot of what people discuss has to do with where they're going as opposed to how to get there. Without method, all you're doing is sort of recommending a kind of madness that has no function. So I think I had to get safe enough over time to be able to come out today.
And we're so glad you did. There are all sorts of wonderful positive comments. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. This was exceptional and inspirational, amazing, beautiful. So lots of positive comments. We have another question from Janice, and she actually has a few questions. I'll give them to you one at a time. She'd like to know, how do you protect yourself from negative energies?
And this is always a question that comes up. I think, as with all things, I do not put myself in a position that entertains them or invites them. The same way I monitor, what I watch on TV, although some of my friends would disagree with that. I really believe that it has to do with the nature of the mind that is approaching these things, and that mind has to be purified. If you look at every major spiritual tradition on the planet, it begins with purification. And the reason it does that is so that there will not be pride, and there will not be the temptation to get distracted by passions that, shall we say, are not conducive to a healthy spiritual progress forward. So I was, I worked very, very hard as a student to do what I was asked to do as hard as I could, and to not be distracted by, I hate to say it, it sounds so archaic, by pleasures of the flesh, right?
Mhm.
Don't be distracted, with entertainment or with fancy food or with the lure of travel. If you're going to be available as a source of light, then you have to make sure that that's what's motivating you and nothing else.
Awesome. Thank you, Sha'alah. Janice has another question. She'd like to know how you clear trauma.
Well, it's called self-examination and confession. I've been involved in certain programs for a very long time that look directly at the nature of what happened to me and the effects it had on me and my wrongdoings and warped behavior patterns as a result. And to recognize them is the first thing, to accept that that is part of what makes me human, what makes me imperfect is part, and that to take any action that is required, no matter how difficult and no matter how tiresome it is. It's one of these things I've been involved in for an extremely long time, actually since 1987.
Mhm.
And it's just one of those things, you get to come around and around. You deal with it to some extent as much as you can, and then you'll come around to it again and deal with some more as much as you can. It's an ongoing process, but with a general lightening all along.
Mhm, mhm. Janice has a follow-up question to her
Mhm.
question about protecting yourself from negative energies. So she says that she's talking about negative energies external to you, how you protect yourself from demonic or negative energies that are external
Okay.
to you.
That's a very interesting question. I always used to frame that to myself as where does the morality in this lie? Where do we get to be good in here? Where does it say we should be good? Because that really bothered me, that's, this idea of being beyond good and evil. I found that very, very troublesome. What I was told a very long time ago, it has to do with how you imagine your world. I was talking to a friend of mine who is spiritually just an amazing woman. And I said I was really concerned because when I was in Texas, I encountered this sort of a real belief in Satan for the first time in my life. And I was very disturbed by the fact that this, it's possible that this is real. And that's terrifying to me. And I'm already terrified by my life. I don't need that in it too. And what she said to me, she said, you choose how you deal with these things. You choose the nature of your higher power. You describe that higher power to have the potency and the benevolence that you need in your life to carry on. And that's where you put your focus. And it seems to have worked very well up till this point. I think fear can actually produce that which we're afraid of. Not so much on this plane, but certainly in these other planes. And I've been graced with a lack of fear. It hasn't been something I made happen. It just seems to be there. Like I'm 5'4" and I'm relatively fearless. But I think that's a very important question. And it's just like in the story of Aslan. It's the purity of heart and the good intent that will keep those powers, if there are such things, at bay.
Thank you, Sha'alah. Well, it's time for us to bring our question and answer period to an end. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, Sha'alah. Some of you had some additional questions we didn't have time for, and Sha'alah did give her website. You can contact her through there, and you can ask her questions then. So thank you very, very much, Sha'alah. And I'm really glad that we got to host your coming out party today.
Me too. Thank you. And thank you to Joe, who is the tech, who is fantastic. Thanks.